Today we're going to be looking at how to shade basic forms. These are the basic forms that make up any object that you could possibly want to draw, whether it's a shoe or a kettle. We're going to examine how light interacts with these objects and also how to create various values using pencil pressure. Before we begin shading basic forms, we need to practice how to create various values with our pencil. So what we're going to do is create a value scale in a gradation. So you're going to draw two rectangular boxes on your paper. One is going to serve as your value scale and the other one is going to be your gradation. A value scale is simply a bar with various steps of value moving from lightest to darkest, and a gradation is a seamless transition between values. So you're trying to blend your values from lightest to darkest. When I talk about value, I'm referring to the lightness or darkness of a color or a tone. When we're shading with pencil, it's simply shades of gray. So to create a lighter value, you use a softer pencil pressure, and to create a darker value, you use a heavier pressure. Before we begin on our value scale, we're actually going to practice some different methods of shading. So these all have different values and you use them in different circumstances. The first one we're looking at is a hatching method. So you're moving your pencil in straight lines in the same direction to create a value tone. The second one I'm doing right on top of the hatching is called cross hatching. So it's basically the same thing except you're moving your pencil in two directions and overlapping them. The next method is a curved method. So you're moving your pencil in little C shapes to create tones of value. And the last one we're looking at is a circulism method. So you're basically creating tiny little circles. It's almost like scribbling to create a tone of value. All of these have merit in different situations. You'll notice as I'm shading that I'm keeping all of my marks very close and tightly knitted together. So I'm creating an even tone of value. There's not white space in there. You want to be careful not to scribble and leave marks open because that accidentally creates a texture that we're not after right now. We're trying to create as even of tones as possible. So these three are acceptable, these two are not. So moving up to our value scale, remember it is a transition from one value to the next. So each step of this box is going to be a different value, and you're trying to fill each box in with one even tone. So you don't want your box to get lighter or darker. You want it to be one solid tone inside each box. So here at box 8, I'm starting with my darkest value, and I'm really pressing firmly with the pencil. I'm being careful to make really neat edges because that's a skill that you're going to need when we move to shading our forms. This is really a practice to help you get used to creating these values. That way, when you start drawing your forms, you're already used to it, and the hardest part is going to just be putting them where they need to go. So as long as you can create the values here, you're going to be set to go on creating them in your forms. Now, you'll notice the 2B pencil, when I'm pressing very firmly, it's actually indenting the paper some. A way to avoid this as a professional artist is to get a set of pencils that have various hardnesses in lead. So the softer the pencil, the darker the lead, and you don't quite have to press as hard, but you can definitely do everything we're doing today with just a regular 2B pencil. That's what I am using. So I'm doing that overlapping cross-hatching method where I'm putting value on top of value, really trying to fill in all of those little white dots and create the most even tone that I possibly can. I've made sure my edges are neat. And so I have my darkest value here on 8. 1 on the opposite side is going to be my lightest value. So once I'm sure that's the darkest one, I can go ahead and move down to the other side of my value scale. 1, remember, is the white of the paper. So 2 is going to be where we start adding value. And we're creating a very light value here. So I'm barely touching the paper. I'm still moving slowly. I'm making sure that I'm not leaving any scribbly white space in here. And with these really light values, it's actually where I tend to see a lot of this in student work. So make sure that you're being careful and filling in all those little scratchy marks and trying to create an even tone. So here I have the lightest tone I possibly can make with my pencil and the darkest tone. So going to the middle 5 is right in between those two. I like to work this way because it just helps me visualize my values a little better. So I'm trying to create a value that's halfway in between. It's half as dark as 8, but twice as dark as 2, and then I will work in the opposite direction, moving towards either my darker side of my value scale or the lighter side. Here I noticed I needed to start moving my steps darker starting at 5, so it's easier to make a value darker than it is to erase and make a value lighter. So it's better to always start off lighter than you think you'll actually need, because you can always overlap and go back on top of it to make it darker. And here we have a finished value scale. So I know that I can create all of these values. So now moving on to my gradation, I want to be able to see every single value I've made over here in the value scale present in my gradation. Because what I'm doing on one end of the value scale is creating a very dark value, and on the other end it's going to gradually transition into the lightest possible value, which is the white of the paper. So here on this end, I'm pressing very firmly with my pencil and creating a very dark value. And as I move across this box, I'm going to gradually release the pressure on my pencil, and it's going to create lighter values as I move across the scale. I want to take a minute to discuss how I am holding my pencil. So I'm holding it on one side and I'm applying pressure with my index finger. You don't want to hold it like you're writing a paper and using that tip of the pencil to shade. It helps to lay it on your desk and then pick it up with one hand and apply pressure with that index finger. And using the edge of the lead, it helps you create those smoother tones, and you're going to find more success in your art.
I'd show you all around. If there's anything left in this town.
See here in my gradation where you can see that transition between the values, I'm going to go back and try to blend out that line the best that I can. I don't want to see any sections of value. I want it to look as smooth of a transition as possible. So where my value scale, I have lines, on my gradation, it should be just a smooth transition where I'm not really seeing sections anymore. Now let's look at the parts of shadow. So first you have your highlight. Your highlight is the lightest part on your object. It is typically the white of the paper that shows through. So this is where the light source is striking the object. Next you have your midtones. Your midtones are various values of gray that transition into the darkest part of shadow. So there's multiple values that your midtones can be. Next, you have your core shadow. Your core shadow is the shadow on the object that is turned away from the light. So your light source can't reach the back of your object, and that is where the core shadow is. So the core shadow are these darkest values down here. So it transitions from highlight, midtones to core shadow. Occasionally, you'll have some reflected light that's bouncing up from the table or objects that are surrounding what you're drawing, and your reflected light tends to be just a little bit lighter if it's in the core shadow. If there's some in the midtones, it's just a step lighter than whatever that midtone is. And last, we have the cast shadow. The cast shadow is the shadow that is cast by your object. So you have your light coming down and hitting your object as well as whatever surface your object is sitting on. But your object is blocking the light from hitting the table where your object is. So it casts a shadow onto the table, and that is the last area of value. I'm going to create diagrams of each of the basic forms we're drawing and label the parts of shadow. So here I'm just creating a key, that way I don't have to write the words over and over again. So my midtones will be symbolized by lines, the core shadow will be filled in, reflected light will be dots, the cast shadow will be squiggles, and the highlight just the white of the paper. Now we're going to draw and shade a sphere. A sphere is a ball shape. So the first thing we're going to do is sketch out a circle. When you're sketching circles, you need to use your shoulder and move your entire arm around while you're drawing. You don't want to just rotate your wrist, because then you get more of an egg shape instead of a circle. So go ahead and use your entire arm and make several lines as you go around, because then you can use your eraser to clean up that circle. And it's easier to see, like, oh, my circle's getting over too far here, so I need to move my pencil this way. And if you just continuously sketch, you're going to get a pretty decent circle to start out with. So we're going to begin with the value pattern. We're going to look at those areas of shadow and be able to understand why the light is hitting that object that way. So the first thing I need to do is establish my light source. So it's coming in and hitting the front of my object right here. So my highlight is a circle shape on a sphere, and I'm drawing thick lines here because I'm working on my value pattern chart. I'm not actually shading it, so it's okay to have those cartoon outlines. My highlights I leave blank, and so I'm not going to fill that in at all. Next, we're going to look at the core shadow. So the core shadow is the side of our object that is turned away from us, so there's no light hitting it at all. And on a sphere, the core shadow tends to be a crescent shape. So we're going to draw kind of a moon shape here on the back side of our object. And on my key, I have that filled in solid, so I'm going to fill it in solid on my key. And when I actually shade my form, it's actually going to be filled in with my darkest value, because there is no light hitting that back of the object. So in between your core shadow and your highlights, you have your mid-tones. So you're going to have multiple values of gray in between that lightest light and darkest dark, and those are going to be your mid-tones. So there's several values there, not just one, as they transition into your core shadow. Reflected light is light that is bouncing up from the table and objects surrounding it. So it really depends on the particular instance as to when and where you use them. But typically they're at the bottom of the object, and sometimes even wrapping around the side. So if you have a light source that's more towards the front, sometimes you'll be seeing some lighter areas towards the edge of your object. It all depends on the situation. Moving to our cast shadow. So the light is coming down and it's hitting the table around our object, but it can't hit the table where our object is sitting. So we have to draw a shadow for where the object is blocking the light. Now we know that a sphere is a circle shape, but when we draw our cast shadow, we don't want it to be a circle shape because our table is eye level with us. So it appears as it's moving away. It gets foreshortened. Do you see how that shape changes as it moves towards eye level and tilts away from us? It's kind of an ovally shape. We call this an ellipse, and that's the shape that your cast shadow is underneath your sphere. So starting at the bottom, because our object is sitting on the surface and there's shadow underneath it, kind of visualize how long that shadow should be and sketch an ellipse shape for your shadow. Do not make it a circle, okay? And the values that you're going to use in your cast shadow tend to be very dark values. Whether you have a crisp or a soft edge all depends on the lighting that your object is in. Now I'm going to actually draw and shade my sphere. So I'm starting out with a circle again. I'm rotating at my shoulder. I'm really looking at the shape I'm sketching and correcting my lines as I go. I'm not just doing one line. I'm sketching several very light lines as I move around the paper. You can see how I started in way too narrow and then I corrected myself and moved it out. Just keep going in this manner until you feel like you've got a good shape, and then come in with your eraser and erase those lines that are kind of out of place, and you'll have a good circle to start off with. You really want to have a circle shape and not an oval shape, because even if you shade this perfectly and your shape isn't correct, it's not going to look right. Now I'm looking at a reference photo, which is always the best practice when you're drawing. You can draw without a reference photo, just following the diagram I showed you, but to create something that is as realistic as possible, it's always good to draw from life. So I'm starting with my highlight, which is the lightest part on my object. It's going to be the white of the paper. And on a sphere, the highlight is a circle shape. And so when I look here at my gradation, I'm going to be creating a gradation of values because my light's coming in and hitting that lightest part, and then it's traveling around the object until it can't get to that back side anymore. So on curved surfaces, we're really working with these gradations. And I know that I'm going to be bringing my darkest value towards that lightest value, and those light tones are really hard to get. So what I like to do around my highlight area, which remember is a circle, I'm going to create kind of a cushion with the lightest possible value that I can make. So it's that number 2 value. And I make it larger than you actually see that value in the reference, because I can always make that value darker. It's harder to get it lighter once it's dark. So creating this little safety net around your highlights really helps you with those lighter values, because those are the ones that people tend to struggle with. Notice how I take that shading right into the edge of my form and kind of hide that line. We don't want to see an outline on our finished drawing. We want our shading to do the job for us. Creating that contrast between the white of the paper and our shaded object is what makes it look 3D in space. So you don't want cartoon outlines. That's why when we first sketched this, we kept it really light, because our shading is going to end up hiding it. You see here that I'm using a combination of methods. So first I was moving in kind of a circular shape, and then I started using that circulism technique of kind of scribbling in towards that highlight. Now I'm going to start working with my core shadow. I like to work with extremes. So I did the highlight, and now I'm moving to my core shadow. And there's a little bit of reflected light down here. So that's why that moon shape doesn't go all the way down to the edge. And remember, your core shadow is the darkest part on your form. It's the side that is turned completely away from the light source. So there's no light hitting it at all. So you want to make sure you have a nice dark base. So I'm pressing very firmly with my pencil. I'm creating clean, crisp edges around my form. That's going to help create that illusion of three-dimensional forms on your paper, is by having those clean outlines. So I'm marking in that shape. I'm going to worry about my gradations later. I'm just kind of placing the values where they're going right now, because my object is curved, and we know that curved objects have gradations. So they blend into each other. You don't have very crisp edges between your values like you do in flat forms. So I'm going to be blending this in all directions, but for right now, I'm just laying those values where they go, and then I'm going to come back and do those gradations. So I know that I need to transition from this value to this value. So all of those tones there need to be present in my shape. And you'll notice I'm switching methods here again. So instead of using that curved method, I'm going back to the little circles, and I'm starting to fade that out. I'm using my pencil pressure only. I'm not smearing it with my finger. I'm really practicing control of my pencil. I'm trying to create a value that's just slightly lighter than that core shadow up against the edge. And then as I move towards the highlight, it'll get lighter and lighter. It might be hard to tell, but on this particular form, I am using curved strokes as I shade. I'm never using that hatching or cross-hatching method because the object is curved in all directions. So there's no reason to use straight lines that'll actually work against you. So as I shade, even if I'm not using circulism, I'm still using curved lines because that's what's going to help give your object the illusion of form and three-dimensionality and make it appear as if it's curving. So no matter what direction your pencil is moving, those contours of the object, we're creating curved lines to help mimic that shape of the form. Here I'm starting to shade the reflected light that's bouncing up from the table. So that edge of the object is still turned away from the light source, but it does get slightly lighter because there is some reflected light bouncing up from the table. So even though that area is technically in core shadow, the reflected light does make it a lighter value. And I'm going in and cleaning up those edges. Remember, really crisp edges help create that illusion of the form being three-dimensional.
Making it sound like I'm not there for you.
Now I'm going to start sketching my cast shadow. So remember, the cast shadow is the shadow that is cast by the object because the light can't hit the table. So I'm imagining where this object is sitting in space, and that shadow comes out and moves away from the light source. It is an elongated ellipse shape. You want to be careful to keep it low and not bring it up too high. When you do that, it appears as your shadow is standing up, or even that it should come back around and meet your shadow over here, which wouldn't make sense with the particular light source we have. So make sure you're not drawing your shadow too high. You're going to be using dark values to fill in your shadow. Now, if you have one direct light source, you're going to have a very crisp edge. But if you have multiple light sources coming in this way and that way, it diffuses the shadow a little bit where you have a softer edge. But right underneath the object will always be the darkest part of your shadow. And as it moves away towards the edges of the shadow shape, it might get softer or it might stay that crisp dark shape. It just really depends on the situation. I'm drawing from a reference, so I'm going to draw the shadow as it appears in my reference. It has a softer edge, so there is not one singular light source in this space, but the one that is most intense is on that side, and that's what dictates the direction that our shadow moves. And there you have it. Now we're going to look at a cylinder. A cylinder is the form of this glue stick here. So it has a curved edge, and then the top and the bottom is a circle, and they are flat. So we know this is a circle, but just like with the shadow on our sphere, when it's moving away from us and becoming foreshortened in space, it creates more of an ellipse shape. And then you have the side coming down with the curved edges. So when we draw this form, we're going to start with an ellipse at the top. And then we're going to take two parallel lines coming down for the sides of our form. So that's our foreshortened circle. And then the two sides coming down need to be parallel. It can be as long as you want it to be or as short. Now, the bottom of our cylinder is also a circle. So you want to make sure that you're not drawing a straight line across because that is going to make it look flat. And the side of our cylinder is curved, so not a straight line. You want to make sure that you're mimicking that same curve you have on the top at the bottom of your cylinder. So that is the basic outline of a cylinder. We need to establish a light source for our object. So I'm going to put it here in the upper left-hand corner. So the light's coming in and hitting this side of the object. But here, the back side isn't receiving any light. So it comes in and it starts to bend around, but it can't hit that back side of the object past that widest point. And so here on this side of our object is where we're going to see the core shadow. That's the darkest part on our form. And then on the opposite side, we have our highlight. So that's the lightest part. In between our highlight and our core shadow, we always see some various midtones in there, and this is a curved form, so we are going to be using gradations. Now, the top of our form is a little bit different. It's flat, right? So the light's coming in and it can't bend around it and create a gradation like on the edge of our cylinder. So we're going to treat that with one value. Now, which value we use really depends on our light source. So if it's up high and hitting the top of that, we're probably going to have more of a highlight tone. But if it's down lower, we might see more of a mid-tone value on that. It really just depends where exactly that light source is. Here in this diagram, I'm just going to leave it a highlight tone. So now talking about our cast shadow. The base of our form is a circle, so we have to imagine where that widest part of the form is because we want our shadow to come out from that widest point. So when we look back here and we see the corner of our object, we're not going to take it from that corner where the bottom and the side meet. We're going to imagine where the back side is and then pull it out straight from there. So it comes up above that corner a little bit, and the shape of our shadow comes out straight, and then the top of it kind of mimics the top of our object, and we have a curved line. So this is the general shape of a cylinder's cast shadow, and in my diagram I'm going to fill that in with squiggles. Here I'm starting to actually sketch the form that we're going to be shading. So I'm using a very light pressure to draw my form because I want to hide those lines when I'm finished shading. You're not going to see an outline like a cartoon. Establishing my light source, and remember I'm going to be using a gradation to create that curved surface, but here on the top I'm going to be using a flat value to fill that in to make it appear as a flat plane. Now I am using a reference photo to draw from, and in my reference photo I noticed that the top of my cylinder isn't that white highlight that I'm seeing on the edge. So that means that my light source is down a little bit lower than I have it illustrated here because the top of my cylinder is a very light value. But needless to say, the side that is turned away from the light is still going to be treated with a very dark value regardless of what my light source is doing. Now here at the bottom I have a little bit of reflected light, so you'll see as I shade this core shadow, I'm not going to bring that darkest value all the way down to the bottom because there is a little bit of reflected light bouncing off from the table, so it gets a little bit lighter there at the bottom. Now up and down on my cylinder it is flat, and then going in this direction it is curved. So you're going to see me using some hatching as well as some curving methods of shading. I'm hatching up and down because the object isn't curved in that direction. You see here beside the highlight I'm creating that cushion of very light value that I'm going to be blending into. That way right up next to my highlight I have the lightest possible value that I can make. And now I'm going in with those C shapes as I'm curving going this direction. I don't want to keep those lines flat because if I do, it's going to make the side of my cylinder appear flat. And I don't want that because the side is curved in that direction. So I make sure that I'm using curved strokes as I shade. Now you see the very abrupt changes in my shading. I am going to go back and blend those out. Right now I'm just laying down some value to begin with, and I'll gradually build up that darkness and that gradation change. You see me switch back and forth between the hatching and the cross-hatching method at various times while I'm shading this, really trying to get that smooth gradation, that blend between the values from that darkest dark to the lightest light. Now that we've created the illusion of a curved surface, it's time to treat the top of our cylinder as a flat surface. And we do that by filling it in with one even value. So remembering back to our value scale where we were filling those boxes in with one solid value, that's what we're doing on the top of our object. So with just a very light value, I'm applying one even tone across the entire surface.
I'd show you all around. If there's anything left in this town.
Now remember, with the cast shadow on our form, the widest point is back behind the form. We can't see it. So it comes up above that corner edge there. And then here in the front, we can see where the widest point is, and we want to draw our shadow out from there with two parallel lines mimicking the sides, and then a curved top following the curve of the top of our cylinder. And our cast shadow is filled in with a really dark value. And this form has several different light sources coming in towards the outside of it. So here closest to our form is where we will create the darkest part of our shadow. And then moving out, that shadow gets a little bit softer towards the edges. So we don't have such a clean, crisp shadow, or even as dark as a shadow as we saw here in our sphere. In forms, when we have the highlight right up against the edge of the form, sometimes we want to hide that line that we've drawn to show the edge of the form. And we can do that by creating a background for our form to set in. And by putting a value in our background, that contrast between the background value and the highlight will create an edge to the viewer's eye. So just by putting two contrasting values together, we've created an edge for where our object ends, and it looks more realistic as if it's setting in a setting and not just a drawing on a paper. Now let's examine how light interacts with a cone. So a cone is kind of a triangular shape that is sitting on a circular base. Remember, a circle in perspective gets foreshortened, so that base is going to be more of an ellipse. And it's not see-through, so we're just seeing the front side of that ellipse. So it's kind of like a triangle with a curved bottom. We want to make sure that the edges of that triangle are nice and even, and we've got that ellipse curve so that it shows that our form is rounded. Establishing a light source, so our light is coming in and hitting this side of the cone and traveling around that. We want to be careful to shade this the right way. So here on our cylinder, we had kind of rectangular shapes, but our value pattern on a cone does not follow that. They're like pieces of a pie. So we want to keep the shapes of our values in kind of triangular shapes. They all need to come up and meet at that point. So it's wider at the base and skinnier at the top. We've got our highlight closest to our form. Our core shadow is always farthest away. It's on that back side of the object. And then in between our highlight and our core shadow, we have various midtones. It is a curved surface, so we are going to be using gradations to fill those in. And you might see a little bit of reflected light bending around the edge of that, depending on where your light source is, or maybe even bouncing up from the table. It just depends on the certain circumstance and where your light source is and what kind of light. So we have that base that our cone is sitting on. So we need to come out from the widest part of that base, just like we did on the cylinder. It comes up above that corner edge, and it's traveling away from the light source. So kind of imagine that light beam coming in and hitting your object and passing by it. That's what creates the edge of the shadow. Our shadow is a triangle shape, and in our key, we're filling that in with squiggles. Notice on all your forms how they kind of follow the same pattern. So you have your cast shadow that is farthest away from your light source, and then highlight, midtone, core shadow. Now to sketch the cone that I'm actually going to shade. So again, whenever you're sketching something for a finished drawing, you need to keep your lines very light because we want to hide them with the shading. We don't want them to show up when we're finished. I am drawing from a reference. Remember, it is always better to draw from life instead of your imagination when you're trying to render things realistically. A good sketch is the foundation of a good shaded drawing, so I want to make sure my lines are even and straight coming down from that point, and the base of my cone is sitting on a circle that is distorted in space, thus creating an ellipse. Make sure that curve is doing what it's supposed to, and I'm ready for value. In my reference photo, the light source is actually on the opposite side this time. So my highlight and my core shadow, they're going to be flipped. So my light source isn't parallel with my object. It's actually a little bit in the front. So it's coming down and it's hitting it right about here when I gauge where the shadow is. So my highlight on my form actually comes in a little bit, and I have some midtones there on the other side of my highlight because the highlight is more towards the front of the form. So my highlight's going to come in a little ways, but I will still have midtones and core shadows that you will be able to see on the cone. So just as before, I like to give a little cushion around my highlight. I want to make sure that it's wider at the base and it goes all the way up to the top. Every area of value that you're creating on this cone should be a triangle shape. So it should be narrower at the top and wider at the base. It's really easy to get in the habit of shading it like we did the cylinder, where it's parallel all the way down, but that's going to make it look more like a cylinder. You have to follow that value pattern to create an accurate rendering of this cone. So make sure that you're keeping the base wide and that the tip of those shadows are going all the way up to the top of your cone. I'm really observing my reference photo and trying to mimic those values that I'm seeing in the image. Now, my core shadow goes all the way to the edge of the form this time. There is no reflected light or lighter values bending around the edge because that light source is closer to the front. That means there's more core shadow on the back that we aren't seeing. And it's really dark. There is a little bit of reflected light that I see at the bottom, so I've kind of marked that space out to know not to fill that in as dark as the rest of the core shadow. Now, you'll notice as I'm shading, I'm using both hatching and the curved method. In the direction that the object is curved, so that's right to left, I'm using curved strokes. But when I move my pencil up and down, I'm using that hatching method, straight marks, because if I ran my finger along the cone from the top to the bottom, it would feel really flat. I wouldn't feel it curve around. But if I ran my finger the other way, I would feel those curves. So I curve my pencil while I'm shading in the direction that the object is curved. If it's not curved, I'm using straight lines. If it is, I'm curving my pencil. Now, when we draw our cast shadow, it needs to reflect the direction that the light source is coming in. So I'm imagining that light in the front, it's not going to come out that direction. It is going to be opposite of the highlight. So it's going to move back away from the highlight, not directly out sideways. So I'm imagining that base, where is the widest point on my form? It's coming out and hitting, and it needs to follow that light source. You see me practicing, pretending that my pencil is like a beam of light coming in. It helps me visualize where that shadow should go and what direction it's moving to create an accurate drawing. Now, in this reference, there is one singular light source, so it has a very crisp edge around the shadow. I'm not going to see the fuzzy edges that I created in the sphere or the cylinder drawing. The edge of that shadow is going to be very sharp and clean because there is just one singular light source with a very hard light. And there we have a finished drawing of a cone. The three forms I've already done all have curved surfaces. So light behaves differently when it's interacting with a surface that is flat. We call that a plane. So when the light comes in, it hits it and it disperses. It does not bend around the edges of 90-degree angles. So here we have been using gradations. Now we're going to be moving to using flat values to fill in the planes on a surface because the light cannot bend around that 90-degree angle. It cannot go past that and come on the other side. So we treat each plane with a different value. There are various ways that you can draw a cube. I'm going to show you it from two different angles. So the first angle we're looking at is as if the cube was sitting in front of us with one of its faces eye level with us. So we're staring at one face of the cube. Now, the top and the side of the cube are moving away from us in space. So they're going to become foreshortened. So that means the shape that we're used to seeing is going to be distorted when we view it from this angle. It is not going to look like a square, even though in our minds we know that it is a square. So those angles change some. Also, what changes is how long it looks. So it appears shorter than it actually is because it is moving away from us in space. The way that we draw this is we take 3 diagonal lines out from the side. Now remember, it gets distorted in space and it appears smaller. So we don't want to draw it as wide as we did on that first face. I'm going to go with about as half as short. And I'm going to draw a vertical line and a horizontal line to close off my box. So I have 1, 2, 3 horizontal lines, 3 vertical lines, and 3 diagonal lines that make up this form. You need to establish a light source. Remember, where this light source goes determines where the areas of value are on your form. Now, there is an edge of this box that we cannot see, and that is where our highlight is on this form. And because it's turned away from us, we're actually not going to see a highlight, but that does tell me that the opposite side is going to be my core shadow. So this whole plane here that I've already drawn, that is all core shadow. So it's going to be filled in with my darkest value. And then we have the side of the box that's facing us. So it's in between the highlight and the core shadow. So that means it's going to be a mid-tone value, just one. We are not going to use gradations on this form. Now the top, that really depends on your light source. So if it is a highlight source, it might be a highlight. If it's a lower light source, it might be more of a mid-tone. It just depends what your light is doing as to what exact value that's going to be. So you can choose to leave it a highlight or you can make it a mid-tone. That is up to you and where your light source is at. Now our cast shadow coming off of our object, the widest part we can see. And we follow the shape that our object is making. There's a diagonal line for the top of that, so I draw that again in my cast shadow. Our cast shadows are elongated, and in our diagrams, we filled them in with squiggles. Now here is the second way to draw a cube. So this time the corner is what is closest to us instead of the side. So I start with 3 vertical lines. One is lower than the other 2. And then I just connect those to the middle one. Now the top of my cube becomes kind of a diamond shape, so I put a dot back there and draw my lines toward that dot. And that is sort of a simplistic way to draw a cube with the angle closest to you. So I'm cleaning up my lines. I really want those lines to be parallel and straight because remember, a good sketch makes for a better drawing. I kept my pencil lines really light because we're going to hide our sketch with our shading. Now, the reference photo I'm using has the light source coming and hitting this side of the box, making that the highlight, the lightest part on the box. So what I need to do is create a background for my form because this box is going to be the lightest value on my cube. So around this box, I'm going to put in sort of a mid-tone to serve as my background. So I'm not worried about making a line for the edge of the table. I'm just going to fill in the whole background like you can't even see the edge of the table. You're just looking at one solid value for whatever the surface is that the object is sitting on. This is good practice for making even value tones because that's what we're going to be doing as we fill in the edges of this cube, because it is made of flat planes, and when you have light hitting a flat plane, you treat it with one solid value. You don't make any gradations, the value doesn't adjust any, it's just one even value along the surface of that plane. I'm going to extend my shadow over some because I'm going to have a cast shadow on this side, and I kind of want that table value to continue. That way it looks like a complete drawing, not just a quick little sketch when I cut it out. This part doesn't have to be super neat. What we're really focusing on is shading the form and making that form look 3D. This is just creating that background. That way we can let that surface where the highlight is hitting be the white that it needs to be. So again, my light's hitting that side, so this back side that we can't see is where my core shadow is. So on this particular form, we're not seeing the core shadow. It is turned away from us. Now these other two planes are going to be midtones, and they're going to be different values depending on where the light source is. So this object has a higher light source, so the midtone on the top is going to be lighter, and the midtone on the side is going to be darker. So I'm going to apply a darker midtone on this edge of the cube. I'm really making sure those edges are clean. You'll notice I'm only using hatching to shade this form, and that is because all the planes on this form are flat. And that hatching method actually gives me a flatter appearance to the object. So on any form you're drawing with flat sides, hatching and cross-hatching tend to be better methods for shading. Here on the cast shadow, because the light is coming in at a slight angle, the shadow isn't that same shape that we illustrated in our diagram. When I'm looking at my reference, it's kind of this really funky shape, and that's because the light is really hitting the corner of this form and not one side. So that's what makes the shape have that point, because if you're imagining that light coming in hitting this corner and that back corner, you look at that top shape and it's pointed, and the shadow mimics that shape. So if you really think about it, it does make sense. And here, right up against the object, I'm making that the darkest part in my shadow. And then as it moves out, it does get a little bit lighter. And there we have our cube. Let's examine how light interacts with a pyramid. So a pyramid is a triangular shape. Now with our cone, it had a curved bottom, but a pyramid is flat. It has a square on the bottom. So we're drawing a straight line for the bottom of the pyramid. And we have one side that is foreshortened, just like we did with the cube. And so it's not as long as that first line because it appears shorter because it's moving away from us in space. So now establishing a light source, I'm going to do the light source like it's coming directly and hitting this front side. So that back side of the pyramid is actually the core shadow, and we can't see the core shadow, unlike the diagram we made on the cube where we couldn't see the highlight. So this is the highlight. I'm going to leave it the white of the paper. Remember, that back side is the core shadow. So that means this side over here is a mid-tone, and we illustrate that with diagonal lines. Now, if that back side's the core shadow, that means our cast shadow is going to come out from behind the object where we can't see it. So we kind of have to imagine that base. It is a triangular shape, and we fill that in with squiggles. Now, just like I showed you on the cube, I'm going to show you two different ways to draw a pyramid. The value pattern diagram had the face turned towards us. So now we're going to look at it as if the corner was turned towards us. So we're going to start with a vertical line, and then both of those edges are going to be moving back into space. So here I draw the corner, keeping that line straight. And then both edges are going to be moving back into space. We illustrate that with diagonal lines pointed upwards, and then we just connect them to the top. So that is the other way that you can sketch a pyramid. Now I'm working from a reference photo that has the light source coming from the left side. So that means that my cast shadow is going to be going to the right. And the widest part of my form, it's going to come out from those corners on each side. So you have to imagine that back corner to figure out where that second line is going to connect to. It doesn't go down to that one on the edge there because my light is kind of hitting the edge of my form. In my reference photo, the side on the right is really dark, so I'm going to go ahead and fill that in with a nice deep value. And the other side of the pyramid is a lighter mid-tone. So I'm going to fill that one in with a lighter value. You can start to clearly see how that sharp contrast, that edge there, really creates two different faces of the object. You see it here in the cube as well. But here on our curved objects, like the cone and the cylinder and the sphere, that gradation gives it the illusion that it is curved. So when you're creating value, you need to be aware when you're trying to create a curved surface, you want a gradation. And when you're trying to create a flat surface, you need one value with sharp edges. Now looking at my reference photo, I noticed that the cast shadow is really fuzzy, kind of like we did in the cylinder up here, but it almost appears as there's a second shadow there. And that's because there are two different light sources, very close in strength, shining on this object. And where they intersect, it creates a darker cast shadow. So here I've kind of sketched them both out, and in between where those two shadows cross each other, I'm making that area on the cast shadow darker.